The show I chose to discuss for the accounting in the headlines activity for week one is one of my favorite shows, How I Met Your Mother. And in this presentation, I'm going to go over 3 episodes from the show that all kind of have like financial interactions in them. The episodes are Down to Trepla from season 3, episode 7, The Ashtray from season 8, episode 17, and The Showdown from season 2, episode 20. Okay, so the first episode that I'm going to talk about is Down to Trepla from season 3, episode 7. In this episode, 2 of the main characters, Lily and Marshall, who are a recently married couple, end up buying an apartment in what they thought was like a new swanky neighborhood called Down to Trepla. And the whole gag of the episode is that Down to Trepla stands for downwind of the sewage treatment plant, and the whole time they're kind of trying to, when they're buying the apartment with the real estate agent, they're trying to be like, we're New Yorkers, we know everything, and it's kind of cool because it deals with the process of like them like buying the house, getting a mortgage, and then dealing with Lily's credit card debt that she's been hiding kind of from everybody in the show. So the financial log, and they never really go into the prices of the apartment, but just for assuming this, the apartment costs $300,000, and that's obviously the asset they're buying. Although, the value of the asset is kind of in question because it's literally downwind from a sewage treatment plant, so it always kind of stinks in their apartment. And then they have their mortgage loan, and that's their biggest liability. They have a down payment, which is their equity in the home, and then they have Lily's credit card debt, which is a liability. The interest that they have to pay on their mortgage, which is another liability, and then the money for their mortgage that they're actually paying down towards the principal of the home, that's their equity. And then another thing is that Marshall went to law school and has like really big student loan debt from doing that. I think this episode is probably the most unrealistic episode out of the lot. I just recently graduated from law school myself and have law school debt, and I couldn't, imagine anybody giving me a loan to buy a house right now. And in the episode, Lily is a kindergarten teacher, and then at the time when they're buying the house, Marshall has basically just graduated law school, just passed the bar, and is just kind of working at his first job right out of law school, which you don't make a whole lot right out of law school. And another thing that kind of adds to the unrealisticness of them actually getting approved for a mortgage is the credit card debt that Lily has, from buying all her clothes, and she kind of has kept that a secret from everybody up until this point. So I think the only reason why they would have even been able to get the house is like if the seller was financing their loan, because they just wanted to get rid of the apartment because, it wasn't really in an ideal location, and who would really want to buy that? So that I don't really think this is realistic. I don't think in the real world they probably would have gotten approved for a loan, but it made for a good TV episode. So yeah. So the next episode that I'm going to talk about is The Ashtray. This is from later in the show, season 8, episode 17. In this episode, the gang ends up going to an art gallery with the captain, who's kind of an on and off recurring character in the show. And what happens in this episode is Lily kind of finds herself to be an aspiring artist, and there's other episodes where she, has sold her art, and she tells the captain, she makes a recommendation to buy this specific painting. He was like ribbing on her, saying, "You're a preschool teacher, what do you know about art?" And just makes fun of her, but then he ends up going back and buying the painting, and then like the whole mechanism of the show is like Ted is the main character, and he's like telling a story to his future kids, so they will do like flashbacks, and they did a flashback in this one where like a couple like years later he ended up being able to sell it for $4 million. So like the initial purchase of the art, that's the captain's liability, and then obviously the art piece itself is the asset, and kind of astronomically skyrockets in value. However, I do think this is kind of a realistic episode because art is kind of like one of those weird assets where like you could buy it and then 20 years later the artist dies and then all of their paintings are worth like 10x of what they really they were when you bought it, just because they died or like they became more popular or whatever. So I think this is probably more realistic than Lily and Marshall getting approved for a loan. But yeah, I thought that was a cool episode. So the last episode I'm going to talk about is Showdown. This is from season 2 and it's episode 20. In this episode, a character, Barney, goes on The Price is Right because he thinks his dad is Bob Barker. It's kind of a joke throughout the whole show that he doesn't know who his dad is. And he ends up winning a bunch of prizes on the game show that he ends up giving away to his friends because he really doesn't care about, winning the prizes. He's there because he thinks he's meeting his dad. And I think something cool to think about in this episode with game shows is that like when you win these prizes, like you still end up having to pay taxes on them, and most of the time the game shows themselves like don't pay the taxes. Like it's up to you to pay the taxes on whatever you win. So in this episode they show him winning a washer dryer set, a home theater, and then a dune buggy. And so he would end up having to pay taxes for that, which I've estimated. And I just think that's this is obviously a realistic episode. He would get taxed on those, whether or not the show ended up paying for it or whether he or whoever he gave it to ended up paying the taxes. It's not really something they discuss in the show, but I thought it was cool to talk about because I couldn't believe that you had to pay taxes on winnings you won in game shows when I found that out, like probably a lot closer than I would like to admit that I learned that. But yeah, it's just a cool episode with something that I thought they don't really talk about that much, but they would end up having to incur tax liability on the prizes he wins. So that's my presentation.